Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to talk with you today about Florida College System updates from the 2019 legislative session. I am Dr. Carrie Henderson. I serve as Executive Vice Chancellor for the Florida College System. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Shanna Autry, Director of Student Affairs, and together we're going to walk you through some key pieces of legislation that relate to primarily academic affairs, student affairs, and workforce. And so really looking forward to connecting with you today. Before we get started, a few logistics from today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded and all materials will be emailed to participants and those who registered for the webinar. We are also going to be putting the webinar recording on the Florida College System YouTube channel as well as emailing it out so folks are able to watch it there. We do have two attachments for you today. The first is a copy of the technical assistance memo that Chancellor had emailed to presidents last month, and that will be a document that we reference throughout the day. And the second file that we have for your download is a copy of the webinar from today's session. We are going to keep participants on mute for the webinar to minimize background noise. We will have time at the end for question and answer. And so as questions come up, please use the questions feature to ask those questions, and we'll be sure to address them at the end of the day. As I said at the top of the call, we do have a copy of the technical assistance memo that was sent out on June 28th from our Chancellor to Florida College System presidents. Today's webinar is going to cover the topics that were included in the June 28th webinar or memo, and we are going to cover additional technical assistance as the weeks move forward. So we encourage you now to download the memo and the handouts pane as well as the materials. So the first piece of legislation that we're going to focus on are legislation that require institutional action. So these are bills that we identified, or sections of bills that require a college within the Florida College System to take some sort of action, whether it be updating a policy, notifying students, communicating with one of your partner institutions, either at the state university system or the Florida College System office. So the first part of this will cover the actions that are required of FCS institutions. So the first area that we want to cover for you today, it comes from Senate Bill 190. And this relates to 2+2 targeted articulation pathways. This provision requires that each Florida College System institution execute at least one 2+2 targeted pathway articulation agreement with at least one FUS institution by 2019-2020, and these agreements must guarantee access to a university degree program, and the key word there is program, so not just guaranteed access to an institution, but to a particular program of study, to students who enroll in the program before completing 30 credit hours, who complete the associate in arts degree, and who meet university transfer requirements. We are aware that all of our institutions currently have at least one 2+2 targeted pathway articulation agreement with universities. We're also aware that new articulation agreements, including those with Florida Polytechnic University, which is relatively new, have been executed recently. So what we don't yet know is the extent to which the existing agreements that your institutions have with state universities comply with the provisions that are outlined in Senate Bill 190. So the provisions related to student eligibility and what the student needs in order to matriculate through these targeted 2+2 pathways. So for us to determine that, the Office of the Board of Governors is developing a rubric for each university to use to assess each targeted pathway agreement for compliance with the criteria established in Senate Bill 190. So we anticipate this rubric will be a checklist. Looking at the previous slide, does the agreement require that students enroll in the program before completing 30 credit hours? Yes, no. Does the agreement require that students complete the entire AA degree? Yes, no, and so on and so forth. The reason why we're having universities start and completing the rubric is because Senate Bill 190 has additional requirements that are specific to state universities that the university would be in a better position to answer. So requirements around providing information on on-time graduation plans to students, requirements around advising of students and making sure students have access to university services while they're on the college campus. So our thought process was having the universities be the first place that's going to review each targeted pathway for compliance with those criteria. And then once the board office receives the rubrics, they'll share those with our office, the Division of Florida Colleges, and we will connect with your institutions to validate the information that's prepared by the universities, just to make sure that, number one, the content is reflective of the content of the agreement, and secondly, to ensure that we've covered all of the 2+2 targeted pathways agreements in this process. So that's information that you can expect will be emerging. That particular rubric, as well as specific next steps, will be emerging in the next several weeks. As this is a requirement from the 2019-2020 academic year, we are moving forward with developing that rubric and getting it out. One thing that we will note, and a question that we've received is, does every 2+2 targeted pathway articulation agreement that we have to meet the requirements as outlined in Senate Bill 190? And the answer to that is Senate Bill 190 just says that at least one 2+2 targeted pathway has to meet those criteria. So moving on to the next component related to articulation, we'll go over the reverse transfer provision. House Bill 7071 had a number of provisions that affect the Florida college system, especially as it relates to our partnerships with school districts and state universities, and reverse transfer is no exception. So House Bill 7071 amends the statewide articulation agreement and provides for reverse transfer when Florida college system students who have at least 30 credit hours transfer to a university before earning the Associate in Arts degree. So it also requires, as part of that, state universities must identify students who complete the AA degree while they're enrolled at the university, and with the student's consent, transfer those credits back to the Florida college system institution for the awarding and eligibility determination of credit. We recognize that many institutions, several of you on this phone call, have engaged in reverse transfer before as part of grant programs and perhaps independently. We also recognize there is immense complexity when it comes to implementation of reverse transfer provisions. And so given the scope and the complexity, we in the Division of Florida Colleges are collaborating with our colleagues in the Office of Board of Governors to establish a statewide committee that's going to have representation from both the Florida college system and the state university system. The Office of Articulation is going to be the coordinating body that represents and brings together FCS and FUS colleagues. We have identified 8 folks from the Florida college system who will be serving as members of these work groups. Once we have them confirmed, we'll share those names with CIA and CSA leadership. Again, our goal is to have a lot of representation from both institutions that have implemented reverse transfer before, those who haven't, as well as different size institutions. So as we think about developing technical assistance at the state level, we think about what needs to happen in terms of business process rules. We would like to have as representative of a group as we possibly can to help inform those provisions. One thing that many of you will note is the 30-hour requirement. And so many of the reverse transfer provisions that are currently in place at a local level have the minimum credit being 15 hours instead of 30 hours. 15 meets the FACT-COC residency requirements. However, the legislature identified the 30-hour mark for purposes of the statewide articulation agreement. So just something to note there. We're also interested in institutions that have used resources like the National Student Clearinghouse or any other resources that can help inform the development of technical assistance, so that as we move forward and think about implementation between the 28 Florida college system institutions and the 12 state universities, we can have as much information as possible. So definitely open to feedback and experience that you all have in implementing reverse transfer. So with that, I am going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Dr. Shanna Autry, to go over a couple of the student affairs related provisions.
Good afternoon, everyone. Starting off with Senate Bill 190, it revised the excess hour surcharge to 100% of the tuition rate for each credit hour in excess of 120%. For those of you trying to do the math in your head, don't worry, I've already completed that for you. That would mean that they're applying the surcharge after about 144 hours. And this revised surcharge is effective for the 2019 summer term and thereafter. Attached is the memo and the memo language that we sent out last month. Many of you may post this statement in things like publications like your catalogs, orientation materials, websites, and other areas, so please be sure to update this information so that students are aware. Next up in House Bill 7071, Career Pathways Agreements, and this requires each career center and Florida college system institution with overlapping service areas to submit a regional agreement for each certificate program aligned with an associate's degree offered by the college. And each of these agreements must guarantee college credit beyond the guaranteed statewide agreement amount toward the aligned associate degree. It must also outline completion requirements for the certificate program in any licensures or industry certifications that must be earned before enrolling in the associate's program. And it also requires colleges to award articulation credit upon initial enrollment in the associate program. We sent a survey June 24th and asked for your sample articulation agreement so that we may review existing career certificate AS to AAS agreements with career centers in college service areas and existing intra-institutional career certificate AS to AAS agreements. And we thank you to those who sent in your existing agreements. So currently the department is also reviewing our statewide articulation agreements as well, because we realize the ones on the website may not be entirely up to date. So we intend to update those as soon as possible so that we can provide guidance for those regional agreements. And the department intends to release a template and technical assistance for those agreements well in advance of the May 1st deadline for all of your regional agreements. Moving on, there are quite a few fee waivers and exemptions this legislative term. First off was Senate Bill 7098, was a waiver for descendants of first responder and active duty who died in the line of duty. It requires us to waive the tuition and certain fees of the child or spouse of a deceased first responder or deceased active duty service member who died while performing official duties. This provision applies to law enforcement officers, correctional officers, correctional probation officers, firefighters, emergency medical technicians, or paramedics. So make sure that you update those. Out-of-state waiver for hurricane-impacted institutions. It allows Florida college system institutions who serve counties that are directly impacted by a hurricane and experience a 10% enrollment decrease due to said hurricane to waive out-of-state fees up to 110% of the degree for 3 years, beginning 180 days after the date of the hurricane. And then finally, the fee exemption for Guardian Assistance Program by House Bill 7099. It simply adds the Guardianship Assistant Program to the already existing DCF waivers that we already serve. So on top of that, all of us may need to review our processes and identify required documentation for individuals that these waivers apply to. And as a reminder, statute 1009.2312A, Florida statute, specifies that Florida college institutions may not charge any fee exempt as authorized by law, and technical requirements for reporting the waiver or exemption will be transmitted to College Reports Coordinator as soon as practical. Colleges are required to report the number and value of fee waivers annually. Now on to residency. Senate Bill 620, residency determination for active duty members, amends the already existing language to add time of acceptance for active duty military spouses and children who are residing in Florida or attending a public post-secondary institution within 50 miles of a military establishment. So institutions may need to review their residency documentation procedures to ensure the residency determination is based on the student's location at the time of acceptance. We understand that time of acceptance is kind of vague, especially you may have different definitions of what qualifies as acceptance. So the Office of Articulation intends to convene the statewide residency committee to discuss the change as well, and they intend to provide technical assistance as soon as it is available. So until then, we encourage the colleges to use their best judgment when applying the definition of time of acceptance. Moving on to House Bill 741, anti-Semitism. It adds religion in the list of categories for which discrimination is prohibited in the K-20 public education system. We know many of you already incorporate religion in your non-discrimination statements and policies, and others may need to add it. The bill also defines anti-Semitism, and it requires all public K-12 educational institutions to treat discrimination-motivated anti-Semitic intent in the same manner as discrimination based on race. Institutions, again, should review their non-discrimination statements to ensure religion is reflected and review procedures where appropriate. And finally, for me, the anti-hazing policies, as outlined in Senate Bill 1080. It requires each board of trustees to adopt written anti-hazing policies and provide a program to enforce anti-hazing rules and adopt penalties for violations. Some of you may have kept this language in your existing Board of Trustees policies. Some of you may have taken them out when they were rescinded a few years ago. It has been reenacted, so you may need to merely just update, or you may need to add them back again. It also created what is referred to as Andrews Law, that provides immunity to certain persons meeting specified criteria who aid at the scene of said hazing incident and helping law enforcement do not flee, things of that nature, to assist law enforcement and the authorities. Just want to point out that this does not specify Greek organizations. So when you're writing your policies or updating your policies, keep in mind that this is applicable to any student group that may be subject to this policy. So think of student organizations, athletics, and the like. And it needs to, the effective date for your policy and all of this is October 1st, 2019. Thank you.
Great, thank you, everyone. So before we move on to some of the informational pieces of legislation that came out of this session, I did want to update everybody on another provision in 7071, which was the Last Mile College Completion Program. And so this provision established what we're going to call Last Mile beginning in 2019-2020 to award the cost of in-state tuition and required fees to Florida students who are residents for tuition purposes, are in good academic standing, have no more than 12 hours to complete their first associate or baccalaureate degree, and who have been enrolled in a regionally accredited institution within 8 years prior to their scholarship application. So really thinking about awarding credit to students through financial aid who are close to completion is the intention of the Last Mile program. This program was subject to an appropriation and did not receive one for this fiscal year. We are encouraging institutions, and I know many of you do this already, scholarship programs where you identify students who are close to completing and incentivize them to re-enroll to complete their degree. And so this is something that we shared with the Council of Presidents and something your institutions may be doing already. Before we we move on to other legislation of interest, we did have a few questions come in that I want to address. So the first question relates to the fee waivers and exemptions, and particularly the one about dependence of first responders. And the question relates to whether or not there's going to be a database at a state level that identifies the first responder dependents. What I can tell you is that this particular statute did give the state board rulemaking authority, and so we are going to be developing a rule to provide more technical assistance and guidance for institutions in implementing this. Part of what we're planning on doing is working with the other agencies within the state to identify how we would go about defining all of those different categories, the necessary documentation if it's available, and the different steps along the way to help institutions understand who is eligible to receive the waiver based on if they're a dependent of a deceased first responder. So that is something that will enter rule development that we're looking at developing in the next several weeks. Though the rule will likely take longer, but we are looking to enter development soon. Our next question relates to the career pathways agreement, so the ones that are between career centers and state colleges. And the question is that in addition to the statewide existing agreements, is there any elaboration about how the awarding of credits would happen beyond any statewide agreement? So I think that's definitely something that we're looking to get more insight from the institutions on. We recognize that the agreements we have, as Shanna said, do need updating, and we might not necessarily have agreements for every single program. So there may be instances where there is a unique program that will need to be captured locally. And in discussions with your career centers, you may also identify additional areas where there might be additional credits. So that's something that's definitely developing. As Shanna said, we've collected some sample agreements, and if you all have other sample agreements as well, we would definitely be open to receiving them. Question about the financial aid, the last mile completion program. Will they be considered Florida resident for financial aid purposes, namely FSAG? Right now, the way that the statute defined it was based on the statutory definition of Florida resident for tuition purposes. That last mile provision also came with rulemaking authority, and so figuring out those different components, especially related to the question about FSAG, is something that would be captured in the rulemaking process. So a couple questions about Senate Bill 190 and the 2+2 targeted pathway agreement and the requirement that student enrolls in the program before completing 30 hours. So yes, that means that the student, and we'll be developing more technical assistance around this, but at its face, the student would identify before they hit 30 hours at the FCS institution their intention to enroll in the targeted 2+2 pathway. Again, we'll be sure to issue more specific technical assistance as we look at those sample agreements. So another follow-up question on 7071, and it's a good one. What if there are existing statewide agreements that cover the amount of credit that's available, and do the regional agreements have to cover anything beyond that? I think that's something that we'll be developing, so that will be information that's forthcoming. Until we have some sample and start to go through, especially the statewide agreements, we'll definitely be issuing more technical assistance around that. So a question about reverse transfer and just kind of talking through the components of it. And as I said, reverse transfer is very complex, but breaking it down just very simply, the idea behind reverse transfer in this context is that many students, I think upwards of 25% of transfers who are in the state university system, transfer before earning the degree from the Florida college system institution. So the idea behind reverse transfer is we have students who have earned, let's say, 30 hours at the college, transfer to university. Through reverse transfer, the university, once the student hits that 60 hours and the requirements for the AA degree, would transfer the credits back to the SCS institution so that the SCS institution can determine if the student is eligible to be awarded the AA, and then awarding the AA if that student has met all of the criteria. Reverse transfer doesn't refer to any action on behalf of the student, so the student is still enrolled at the university. Reverse transfer is mainly referring to the transfer of credit from the state university back to the Florida College System institutions to be awarding the Associate in Arts degree. Another question related to excess credit hours and how the provision that increases the hours from 110 to 120 will affect students. Essentially, it allows students a little more flexibility in terms of accumulating additional credits, and provides, again, a little more flexibility in terms of when they'll be assessed that excess credit hour surcharge. So there have been fluctuations over time, and in the statute is effective dates, because as I said, the language has fluctuated over time, but it essentially gives a little more wiggle room for students. Questions actually about the civic literacy adoption timeline. Appreciate that question, Mark. So as we reflect back, I think the 2017 legislative session, you will likely recall that the legislature required a civic literacy provision be added so that students who are entering the Florida College System and the state university system are required to demonstrate competency in civic literacy. Currently, the approved State Board of Education rule identifies two specific courses, POS X0 41 and AMH X0 20 as the required courses to demonstrate competency. The board rule also identifies a number of assessments that students can also use to demonstrate competency, such as CLEP and advanced placement. One of the discussions we've been having is around adding additional examinations, specifically the naturalization assessment and the timeline for that. We will be working on and are working on rule development to identify additional low-cost options for students to demonstrate competency. So that is something that's on our radar and something that we're working toward. The effective date for the excess hour surcharge. So that surcharge will be in place as of summer 2019 and beyond. And then another question, will the department assist with identifying students who fall into the last mile? Do you have information about students, transfer, graduation from all public institutions? That's a really great question, and something that I think will be open for rule development. I don't think we've gotten necessarily that far. That particular provision of 7071 did require the department, again, subject to appropriation, to create essentially a portal for students to identify if they want to be considered for the last mile. The department's responsible for having a website that would then refer the institutions, or I'm sorry, refer the students to the institutions, and the institutions themselves would make the determination about eligibility. Since that particular piece of it hasn't been funded, we haven't gotten too much farther, but as we think about next legislative session and rule development, that's definitely going to be something on the table for discussion. Great, thank you. So lots of great feedback. Continue to ask questions, and then I'll pause again to answer some of them. We really appreciate the level of engagement and interest in this. So as we move on, I'm going to transition a little bit to talk about legislation of interest. So these are things that affect the Florida college system in one way, shape, or form, and could have ripple effects based on the students who we serve and as they transition across the K-20 system. These are not necessarily things that require institutions to complete an action immediately. So that's the distinction between these particular pieces of legislation that we're reviewing in this section. So the first thing that I'll call your attention to is House Bill 7071, again, a huge bill for us this session, which is the annual review of CTE offerings to determine the alignment of existing offerings with employer demand, post-secondary degree or certificate programs, as well as professional industry certifications. 7071 identified a number of different components that will be included in that annual review, including identifying the CTE offerings that are linked to occupations that are in high demand by employers, occupations that require high-level skills, and occupations that provide middle-level and high-level wages. House Bill 7071 also requires within that annual review a phasing out of CTE offerings that aren't aligned with the needs of employers or do not provide completers with a middle or high wage occupation. And it also encourages school districts and Florida college system institutions to offer CTE programs that are not offered currently, that based on data, based on employer feedback, are going to be emerging fields that Florida needs to develop a talent pipeline for. This is likely familiar for many of you who've been following the executive order that the governor issued in January, Executive Order 1931. Some of the language does mirror what went through in House Bill 7071. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Executive Order 1931, the governor issued it in January to set the goal for Florida to be #1 in workforce education and career and technical education in the country. And so drawing upon our post-secondary attainment rate, so the percent of students who have some sort of post-secondary credential, the governor set forth a charge to hone in on a number of legislative priorities that we've talked about today. So things related to reverse transfer, last mile, again, strategies designed to help students earn credentials. And a critical component of the executive order was the development of an annual audit of programs. And so for purposes of implementation, the department is moving forward interpreting the provisions of House Bill 7071. We're capturing those as we move forward with implementation of the executive order. So we're not going to have two separate processes for implementation. We have, as a department, been in the process of identifying a number of experts across the state on secondary and post-secondary education in the CTE area to identify program quality indicators. So what is it that we're trying to measure in terms of determining program quality, so that we can then think about what the charge of the executive order and what the charge of House Bill 7071 is around offering credentials of value and building Florida's talent pipeline. We released an interim report a few weeks ago, and there will be a hyperlink in the file that you downloaded the handout section so you can view the interim report, summarizing the activity taken to date related to the executive order. It is going to be an iterative process that has a number of different phases. So where we are now currently is we're inviting feedback from the public on draft program quality indicators. So these are the measures that we'll be considering as we conduct the audit. So measures related to market demand, completion, industry certification, job placement, and we would absolutely welcome feedback from this group on the draft program quality indicators. In August, we will be identifying baseline data at the program level, looking at identifying benchmarks for the programs, and beginning the statewide review of programs. For a little context, if you look at all of the programs with an approved curriculum framework and all of the unique programs in the Florida college system and the school districts, we have about 900 unique programs. And if you multiply that out by how many institutions we have offering programs, that number gets closer to 6,000. So for the first review, we're going to only be looking at a statewide review of programs, and then we'll be looking more closely at the institutional level in several months. So wanted to provide that update. related to House Bill 7071. As we said, lots of interest in career and technical education, and would encourage you to check out some of the language around career and technical education. So providing students with an opportunity while they're in secondary to have a signing day. That's something that happens a lot already, but thinking about a scholarship signing day as well as a college and career decision day, again, to instill that culture of college going and a career going community. We also saw some changes related to secondary curriculum, so allowing computer science courses as a substitution at the secondary level for mathematics or science, adding required financial literacy courses, creating a pathway option for career and technical education, requiring dual enrollment articulation agreements between career centers and then the Florida Pathways to Career Opportunities Grants Program. So our colleagues in the Division of Career and Adult Education will be and continue to issue technical assistance around these areas. And so as that information becomes available, particularly related to the grant program, those are opportunities that we'll make sure the Florida College System colleagues have access to. Some other legislation of interest, there were a couple provisions related to completion, so post-secondary completion as well as degree attainment. The last mile was captured in a couple of places, and so again, just reiterating the idea of identifying students who are close to completion and incentivizing them to re-enroll. Many of you are familiar with the Higher Education Coordinating Council, HEC, which has been in place for several years now. That committee has evolved into what is now known as the Florida Talent Development Council. So prior to this provision, the Higher Ed Coordinating Council included representatives from the different public institutions, so the SUS and the FCS Chancellor, as well as representatives from industry and the private education sector as well. The Florida Talent Development Council expands the membership to focus on a number of other workforce-related organizations. The technical implementation of the council will move from the department and the Board of Governors to the Department of Economic Opportunity, and the membership will be expanded. So I think what we can take away from this is the growing interest and the growing accountability that we feel as a state for post-secondary attainment does not rest solely in one education system. It really is a collective effort across the state to ensure that Florida has the talent it needs to meet the demands of today's workforce and tomorrow's workforce. So the Florida Talent Development Council is something that DEO is currently looking at forming. And that council is required to develop a strategic plan around educational attainment and alignment between secondary and post-secondary CTE programs with the workforce. And so I think that's something you can expect to see additional information come out of as we move forward. Many of you are probably also familiar with what was formerly the Rise to 55 initiative, which was known as Resourcing Industry for a Strong Economy. It was an initiative that was led by the Higher Education Coordinating Council that set a goal to increase the educational attainment rate of Floridians to 55%. What we saw with this legislative session was codifying what our new attainment goal is and changing it from Rise to 55 to Sail to 60. So again, looking at alignment between education and industry, and then also setting the attainment goal from 55% to 60%. For a little context, our current educational attainment rate within Florida, which is the percent of Floridians who are within working age, so 25 to 64-ish, and have some sort of post-secondary credential beyond high school. So it can be a certification or a baccalaureate associate degree. That current rate is right around 49%. So this set a goal to increase that attainment rate to 60%. And I think we will see several efforts probably come out of the Talent Development Council about how institutions can support the attainment effort, not only at a statewide level, but also at a local level. Many of the Florida College System institutions participated in a number of regional attainment convenings and received attainment mini grants. And so I think attainment is something that you'll definitely see the Florida College System's efforts and engagement around. Also related to completion and attainment, 7071 also identified that the chancellors of the Florida College System and the state university system collaborate to publicize a number of statewide efforts that are related to college access, college affordability, college success. And in statute, it identified a number of those specific efforts. So the Florida College Access Network and many of our institutions and regions have local college access networks as well. Some of our institutions participate currently in the Complete Florida Degree Initiative. For those who aren't familiar with the program, it is a concierge service that identifies students who have some credit toward a degree and seeks to reach out to those students and have them re-enroll in an online education program and provides them with a number of supports as well as access to scholarship opportunities to help them be successful in post-secondary. I believe 4 or 5 of Florida College System institutions participate, a number of state universities participate, and a number of ICA, so independent colleges and universities participate as well. So Complete Florida is an area that we will be working on. We will be disseminating a survey to our institutions to get more information about your level of knowledge awareness around Complete Florida. That's one of the pieces related to 7071 that we'll be working on, is looking how to remove barriers to students' enrollment in this program, as well as how do we increase the number of not only institutions who are participating, but the number of students who are participating as well. So we will be reaching out to our colleagues on the academic and instructional affairs side to have you all complete a survey for us in the next couple of weeks to give us more information about Complete Florida and ways that we can make recommendations around strengthening it. In addition, 7071 identified publications of summer bridge programs. So thinking about how do we share information around best practices and strategies related to summer bridge programs. They come in all shapes and sizes. And so are there lessons learned that we can distill and share out with a larger community? Also publicizing the efforts of the Florida Virtual Campus, also known as FLVC, so the statewide advising portal that houses a number of pieces of data and information that's very helpful for students, including degree audits to help them as they think about transferring, being transient students, and a number of other different services. And then lastly, the state university system and the Florida College System to collaborate around awarding credit for prior learning. We currently have a rule that requires institutions to have credit for prior learning for military experience. We know locally as well, many institutions have credit for prior learning policies. And so as we look at implementation of 7071, I think you can expect from the system office a little bit more of an understanding about best practices around credit for prior learning and if there's any consistency that can be brought to that process. So a few other pieces, legislation of interest. House Bill 501 titled Alternative Treatment Options for Veterans. It authorizes the VA to contract with state universities or Florida College System institutions to provide alternative treatment options for traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. So these treatment options might be things like equine therapy or other types of therapy for veterans who are dealing with brain injuries or stress disorders. We don't anticipate many institutions will necessarily on the Florida College System side be a part of this. But that is something we at least wanted to put on folks' radar, that the VA is now able to contract with public institutions in Florida to provide treatment options for veterans. We did have 2 institutions have new names. So congratulations to North Florida College, formerly North Florida Community College, and the College of the Florida Keys, formerly Florida Keys Community College, on your new names. We are working certainly to update our information and congratulate these institutions as they go about this process. And then the last thing that I'll share is information that we've also forwarded to the instructional affairs folks around teacher preparation. There were, within Senate Bill 7070, amended general knowledge exam requirements, and so modifications to certification requirements relating to the general knowledge exam, and so making sure that your teacher preparation programs are aware of those. So before we wrap up for the day, we do have a number of questions that have come in, and please feel free to submit more questions, and we're happy to go through them. So a question about performance funding and a status of that. So the performance funding that was allocated during this legislative session was allocated through proviso language. So both the House and the Senate identified a certain pool of money, $30 million, and requested data around certainly areas that we've focused on through performance and funding in the past, like retention, like completion, but broke it up into two categories. One is focused on AA and transfer, and one is focused on workforce programs. And so the department did provide data and information to legislative staff around the requested information, and legislative staff, through proviso language, allocated the funding. So there is performance funding allocated this legislative session. The department did not receive the ability to award it through the current approved performance funding model because it was awarded in proviso language. So we are working with legislative staff to make sure that we're sharing more information about what the specific measures were, so institutions are aware and have a sense of what is being captured through performance funding. A question related to the targeted 2+2 pathways and data reporting. So will we need to report intent to transfer to a specific university, or will we need to report each program individually? That's a great question. And we haven't quite yet come up with what the performance or reporting expectations are. If it's something that is going to come through a state database, or if it's something that's going to be tracked more locally. Right now, with existing targeted 2+2 agreements, we don't have any reporting requirements, but given the focus of this work, that is something that we will be exploring through technical assistance. So a question about metrics. Will institutions be able to receive the same metrics like we have in the past, specific to the performance funding model? So I think that question is asking, are you able to receive your rates, perhaps, so that you can look at changes over time? Yes, Mike Johnson, thank you for clarifying that. You know, that is a great question, and definitely something that we can look into and get back to you. I definitely understand the desire to see changes over time. So that is something that we can certainly work on. All right, feel free to send in some other questions. Did get a question about if the Pathways to Career Opportunities grant program was funded through a legislative allocation. We're going to double check on that, but our understanding is that it wasn't funded this session, but we'll let you know otherwise. All right, feel free to ask a few more questions. Great, getting a few more questions. So a question about the computer science course substitutions requirements. That is strictly at the high school diploma level, so that's not something that would apply to any of our programs. And students who use the substitution will still get a standard high school diploma. So it will affect their course taking within high school, but those students will still earn a standard high school diploma, which is information that is useful for our institution. A question that I sort of chuckle at, Cheryl, thank you, which is, if SUS institutions can award the AA, what's the impetus for them to reverse transfer students back to the Florida college system? You know, I think it's definitely a great question and one discussion that we're having with institutions. Institutions in the state university system, to Cheryl's point, are able to award the AA, and 190, I believe, included a number of other requirements where state universities need to now more actively promote the AA degree and make students aware at orientation and at various points along their educational pipeline that they're able to earn the associate in arts degree. What we've heard, and your institutions may hear this as well, many state universities don't necessarily see the AA as central to their mission or the AA as critical to, you know, their performance funding and performance incentive system. So in the past, we've gotten positive reception from some institutions on the university side to recognize the value that this could bring to the Florida college system institution. We are going to be discussing sort of business rules for, you know, what if a student at the state university is a former Florida college system transfer and they technically can be awarded both, like through reverse transfer back or through the AA. I think that's going to go a little sticky, and so something that we'll be looking to tease out in technical assistance. All right, still have a few more minutes for additional questions. I'll pause to see if any come in. All right, so without seeing any further questions come in, we are going to wrap up today's webinar. The contact information for myself as well as Dr. Autry is on your screen. We are more than happy to answer any questions you might have, any specifics. As we discussed at the top of the call, there is still technical assistance being developed, and so as more information comes out, we will be sure to make it more available to you all. These materials are available before you leave as a handout, so you can download them right here. We are also going to be posting this on our YouTube channel, and so feel free to share this information with colleagues and refer to this information. So thank you all for the work you do for the Florida college system, and we look forward to connecting with you soon.